Grant Swinburne, and I'll be your guide as we explore the world of landscape photography through the eyes and lenses of photographers, both up and coming and seasoned professionals. I like to dig a little deeper into the way they think about their photography, how it fits in their lives, and where they see it going into the future. Joe Cornish has been photographing landscapes professionally since the early 1980s, and few people in the UK have thought more carefully or more deeply about what landscape photography actually is. With an art school background and early influences including Ansel and Edward Weston, Joe has always approached the landscape as an expressive art form rather than simple documentation. That philosophy runs through dozens of books, National Trust commissions, artist-in-resident projects at Fountains Abbey and Brimham Rocks, and a career that earned him an Honorary Fellowship in the Royal Photographic Society. In this episode, Joe talks about cultivating curiosity and visual literacy as foundations for better photography, the value of collaboration and peer learning, and why he finds the craft of editing and printing as creatively satisfying as being out in the field. He also reflects on landscape photography's relationship to environmental change and the role images can play in helping people value the natural world. I hope you enjoy the show. G'day, Joe. Welcome to Landscape Photography World. Thank you for coming on the show.
Hello, Grant. Good to meet you.
Thanks. Let's talk landscape photography. I know you've got a long history in a number of genres, but landscape for you became your genre around in the mid to late 90s, I believe. And I guess I'm interested in why people are landscape photographers. Why did you choose landscape? What was it that triggered that bug that many of us and many of the people listening have been bitten by that says landscape's the thing for me?
The answer really goes back a long, long way back into childhood. Because as a kid, I was absolutely chronically shy, and thinking about it now, in modern terms, that would probably be described as neurodiverse, I suspect, or kind of chronic introvert. And in a way, I also my hearing wasn't great, so I came from a family of very good musicians, and I was the only one of them that couldn't play a note, mainly because I couldn't hear. And also that had a big interrupting factor on my education. I mean, these are strange things to sort of, it feels a bit like a confessional, because I probably realize now, that partly because the way the conversations have changed in society around how we analyze our personalities and how they've impacted on our lives. And in fact, for me, all of these sort of rather negative sounding beginnings have had a huge positive impact, because it's allowed me to have the career that I've had, which has been an incredible privilege, I suppose, in retrospect. But to return to your question, how did it happen? I suppose if you think of somebody who's fundamentally not very people orientated, then nature is a solace. I mean, I think it is for most humans, but
Absolutely.
it certainly was for me. I was always happy outside. And as a kid, I spent a lot of time, yeah, jumping around in rock pools and stuff when we went on holiday. And I, was a physically active child. I didn't have any problems in that regard. So I did a lot of sport and so on. And so I enjoyed the physical challenge of the outdoors. So that was a sort of beginning point, if you like, feeling quite connected to nature through its capacity to challenge. And then as a student at school, I realized I had to have a talent for drawing and painting, particularly drawing. I think more than painting. I always found painter and so on difficult, but form really fascinated me, and design and those ideas. Did a lot of drawing, never touched a camera until I went to university.
Wow.
And that, so I'm a late starter. I think a lot of my contemporaries now whose dads gave them a camera when they were 9, 10, 11.
Yeah, well, that was my case. I got my first camera, a little 110
Yeah.
point and shoot film camera, and yeah, I think I must have been about 10 or 11 years old when I got mine.
I think that's right. It is a pattern, and it's lovely that people had the early start. So I had to sort of make up for lost time a little bit. On the
Definitely.
other hand, I would say that there were a number of advantages the way it worked out for me, because I already had a kind of discipline in visual language
Mm.
through my art. I studied art at university, including art history, and also I was actually quite good at writing. So I did English literature for a short while, and I mean, I didn't want to write essays all my life. I was much more interested in making pictures, whether that was with the pencil, printing, painting, or photography. And it just the landscape connection, just to try to return to that and not lose the track of your original question, is because when I just discovered my love of using the camera, literally almost everything I did, those first rolls of film, were trees, and a few other things, but mainly trees. And it's in some ways it hasn't really changed. I mean, it gradually I did more beaches, and it was all nature, pretty much. I realized that I was more interested, curious this one, but that wild animals. I mean, I love the wild world, but I didn't have immediate innate passion to want to capture or take pictures of birds in flight or animals outdoors. It was much more to do with
Yeah, sure.
form,
Sure.
light, composition.
Mm.
That's what got me really excited. And so landscape is, it's the obvious topic because it's so ambient everywhere.
Yeah,
Every landscape is
you can't
is
avoid it.
you can't. It's with us all the time. It is literally, our mother planet.
Mm.
And every time you walk out the door, you're in some kind of landscape, whether it's urban, rural, wild, whatever. So those the accessibility of it was important. And I've experimented with many different kind of landscape themes over the years, and it's taken me decades to get to the point where I kind of feel I know now why I'm doing what I'm doing. So, and your question is really predicated on why, I think.
Yeah, definitely. The why is, I think, important to understand, and like you, I think many of us don't come to it until you've actually had some experience. One of
Yeah,
the questions I often ask, and I think your case is probably slightly different to many, is where did the art start in your photography, as opposed to documenting, a
mm,
hike or a nice scene that you see. And okay, I've now gone out with the intention of creating an image and using light, form, and those other elements to actually produce something which is artistic as opposed to just a pure record of
your
something that I've
record. Yeah,
seen.
yeah,
And
yeah.
yeah, I just find it fascinating where people sort of start to draw that line. It sounds like that happened fairly early on for you because of your art background.
The art really came first. So,
Yeah.
really, from the moment I first looked through the viewfinder of my first single lens reflex camera, I was trying to make a picture that had some kind of cohesive formal quality, in terms of shape and form. So those were always there. I mean, it's not a unique background, of course, but it's more usual for people to have a more functional aspect to their photography. Whereas for me, it was always about the artistic side of it. And I was fortunate, I think, to see some really fantastic photography from a young age while I was still a student. I saw an exhibition of Ansel and Edward Weston. I think
Mhm.
actually there was some work shown at our university. And then I also had there was a guy joined our course a couple of years after me. It's a 4-year course. And it was a mature student, Jim, and he was already an established photographer
Yep.
in the art world, and his prints were absolutely wonderful. And it helped to kind of reinforce. I mean, I always mention Jim because I know that, to be honest, without his influence, I'm not even sure we'd be talking here today. I think all those revolving door moments. Meeting him is probably one of the most important things, because he gave me or helped me to realize that the fact that I wasn't doing very well at other aspects of my art in at university wasn't really a problem, so long as I was excited about what I was doing, and that photography was what excited me the most, and it did. And that's why I ended up becoming a photographer. And then the nature connection, being trying to sort of, the first time I saw Jim's work, or Ansel Adams, Edward Weston, Paul Strand, the photographers of that order, and then many, many more. But they were all really in the landscape area. And it just, I never really had a moment where I didn't think landscape photography was or could be an expressive art form. For me, that was fundamental to is a defining characteristic of landscape photography. And that because I'd studied painting in some depth, and I've studied it considerably more since, I fundamentally see landscape as an abstraction of the human condition. So it has the potential to express our inner world, and that's really what makes it so appealing. Sorry.
Yeah, it's definitely a theme that keeps coming up, is that expressive nature of looking at the world and trying to distill down the essence of a feeling of being in a place at a certain time. And whether that's the light, the play of light on trees or water or mountains or whatever, or waves, movement, etc. It's that feeling that comes with those sorts of images that I think is probably one of the most challenging things for new photographers to approach and get their heads around. Okay, they're still working their way through the technical aspects of using the equipment that they've got and so forth, which is for some quite a steep learning curve anyway. But then on top of that, you've actually then got to start to say, okay, well, how do you actually express yourself? Now, I know that that is part of many of your workshops and the education that you do. What would be the thing that you sort of stands out to you that says, okay, well, this is how you start to do that with your photography as a new photographer? If a newbie came up to you and said, okay, tell me what I need to do.
Yeah, so it's still the great sort of intangible aspect of photography in a way, isn't it? I think that you feel ultimately that there, if you have an eye, and I hate to use that term in a way because it sounds very fuzzy, but most people, it's a bit like music, isn't it? I think that, I personally don't think I can sing in tune actually, but my relative to the rest of my family, I'm completely useless.
Yeah.
But they would probably all say, well, everybody's a potential musician, and on the face of it, I would say everybody's a potential photographer. But there's no doubt, I think you can say there's no doubt that some people have an eye for a picture, whether it's drawing, painting, whatever. I mean, I found that, because I was drawing from a very young age, is, where does all that begin? Because I think what I learned to do was to see in proportion while I was I was even a teenager. So I could look at something in the real world and copy it. And fundamentally, that I think that's why I'm a photographer, because I'm interested in the idea that reality itself is a topic of great interest. That we don't necessarily have to turn it into a painting to make it interesting. And so that precise observation is what drove me. But to return to the issue of workshops, if speaking to a newbie or somebody starting off, then what I would sort of gently like to try to convey is the idea that although there's all these kind of, I wouldn't call them rules and regulations, but you know what I mean. People try to sort of
Yeah, the rule of thirds, etc., the golden
elements-based ways
ratio, etc.
of solving visual problems. But actually, I think the most important thing is to be yourself.
Yeah.
And that's not an easy thing to define. If you don't feel you have an identity as an artist, then how are you to know who you are? But I would sort of the way I try to guide people is to give them the confidence to say, well, whatever you see that catches your eye, that is of interest to you, that's your subject, and that's, and I use the word subject advisedly. It's not actually necessarily a subject. It might just be a feeling. It might be to do with, if we take an obvious example, the relationship between two trees, or how a blade of grass reflects the shape of a rock nearby. It could be that, or it could be that it's a more subject-focused view, but it's what catches your eye. That's where you start. If you don't have an interest in the subject, it's very, very hard to convey, to make an interesting picture of it. If that makes sense, I
Absolutely.
think.
Yeah.
And I still try to stick to that general guide now. I mean, I fail a lot of the time as a photographer, but I love practicing photography so much. I'll go out with my camera anyway. And even if I'm not having a good day, then I still enjoy myself. So it's a source of pleasure just to be out with the camera, looking at the world, looking around me. And that's also a mentality that I think is worth cultivating with anyone who's wondering how they become a photographer. Is just is establish that curiosity for the world. And it may not be so nature focused as mine definitely is. That's my thing. But some people enjoy the urban environment, or built environment. Or my friend David, who inevitably comes up in conversation, David Ward,
Mm-hmm.
he is extraordinary at photographing derelict objects
Yep.
and places where they decay. And he's developed an extraordinary kind of, I hesitate to use the word relationship, but see the world in terms of how it breaks down. And these are all natural processes fundamentally, but it's often to do with the interaction between the made environment and how that decomposes over time.
Yeah.
And you can see all sorts of fascinating philosophical themes that can be applied there. But ultimately, it's a visual art form,
Mm.
and ultimately these ideas have to communicate visually. And that's the hardest thing of all, because the visual language is personal, and I don't think it can be described as a set of rules. Ultimately, it is it's very complex, it's very personal, and ultimately you have to do what gives you joy.
Yeah.
So those things: do what gives you joy, cultivate a curiosity for the world around you, and practice your seeing and practice your photography. But your seeing is the most important thing, because let's face it, as you well know, the techniques of the camera are relatively straightforward compared to
Yeah.
the artist.
Once you understand your camera and your gear and how it
Yeah,
works and what you can do with it, then everything else is about the creativity of where you point it, what you include, what you exclude, how the light plays on the subject, etc. They're the things that then you can start having fun with, and I
yeah,
love what you said, is, have a passion for seeing, and it's that to me is really the essence of something that if I was teaching somebody that came along and said, all right, well, tell me what you know, that's going to be number one. Have fun with it and
yeah.
play with it and experiment with it until you feel comfortable with it. And once you're comfortable with it, then you can move on to other things.
Yeah, exactly, exactly. And then there won't necessarily be a day when you think, right now I'm comfortable with it, but there's a gradual
Well, yeah, it
transition.
might be
Yeah,
years.
yeah, exactly. And also in the meantime, you're cultivating your seeing,
Exactly,
as you
exactly.
go. There's no
Yeah.
sort of hard threshold. But yeah, it's a fascinating. It's interesting that there are, of all the many photographers I've met and worked with over the years, this is everyone's unique,
Mm.
and everyone has potential. I think so much of it is down to confidence and practice.
Yep.
And if you can cultivate confidence through practice, then sooner or later you're going to be making pictures that hopefully give you pleasure. And if they give you pleasure, chances are will give other people
Give
pleasure as
somebody
well. And
else. Yeah.
that may not be essential to you, but if you're trying to make a living, then obviously it helps. So
Mm. Mm.
that other people like it.
You've been in, you mentioned earlier that you saw initially photography as a bit of a solitary pursuit. And many
Mm.
photographers often say that, they go out into the field and they like to be shut off and alone. And you yourself, though, have also been involved in a number of collaborations with both other photographers, other artists, authors, and so forth. What draws you
Mm.
to those collaborations, given that landscape photography is seen as a solitary pursuit?
Yes, yeah. Well, I think because it is a collaboration. I think that and maybe because landscape photography itself is quite solitary, and I do think that there's we all, no one has a totally simply defined personality, like a totally solitary individual. I think everybody, to some extent, needs the input, the feedback, the communication with other human beings. So we are herd animals after all.
Definitely.
And while I definitely would say I'm probably on the introvert part of the spectrum, I also love working with other people. I might sometimes express myself in a way that suggests that I have a quite a misanthropic view of humanity, because we do so many awful things to this our beautiful wonder planet that's home.
Yeah.
But at the same time, all my friends and family I think are amazing. So I just love working with other people who share some kind of interest in the creative process. And so the collaborations, whether that's with book designers or with other photographers or with musicians or painters, is always fascinating. And part of it is it's just a stimulus to the conversation. I mean, you might end up doing a book together or an exhibition, and all of that is the, if you like, the kind of transactional result of the
Sure.
collaboration. However, the best part of the collaboration is the conversations. Is the talk that you have, and the common ground, or the differences, or the learning that comes about as a result of thinking, oh, I'd never thought of that before, or I hadn't noticed that, or I hadn't seen. And how is it that photographer X is able to see things that I can't? And that's amazing. And it kind of helps you to it helps expand your range in lots of ways, but it also helps you understand yourself better by realizing, well, that's not me, so I will need to focus on what I see and how I do things. So, there's so much to be learned, but I think ultimately it's about realization in a way, how to fulfill your unique, identity as a photographer. And in that I wanted to just bring up a phrase which I'm very fond of, that you probably know, but it's a Robert Adams description of an interesting landscape photo, which is something that includes geography, autobiography, and metaphor. Have you ever heard that?
I have. Yeah. Yeah.
Yes, beg your pardon. Anyway,
No,
it's
it's fine.
I
It's
think
great.
it's great. It's sort of, because that is ideally, if you have a picture that contains all of those things, then there's something for everyone.
Absolutely. Yeah. What's the most surprising thing in one of your collaborations that you've discovered?
Oof, surprising. That's a good question, because it suggests, yeah, because a lot of the time that you can predict the result's going to be a positive one, clearly, because
Sure.
you together you make more than the sum of the parts. Um, I think one of the surprises, I will say, been a big surprise for me, is that I've worked with some of the greatest painters in the UK today in the landscape field, and one of the things that surprised me is how much respect those painters have for photography. Because I think when I was at university, I sort of felt that painters just looked down on photographers as mere technicians, just camera
Well, all
operators.
you do is push a button and that's it.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, anyone can do that, right? Yeah. So
Whereas
and
I've spent a year, detailing those
that's right.
wildflowers.
Yeah, exactly. And so I had a kind of a chip on the shoulder, if you like, about that, relationship. It's not that by the way, I'm not particularly interested in the whole debate about whether photography is an art or whatever, because I don't really think it matters that much. I think photography is just a
Sure.
fantastic thing to do, and
Mm.
it self-evidently has an artistic component, but it also has these other elements to it,
Yep.
whether that's science, instrument of record, history and technology and so on. But painters, see themselves as pure artists, and understandably so. But it turns out that these painters who are friends of mine, they have a high regard for both photographers and the photographic process, and a great interest in it. They don't necessarily use photography themselves, but they don't see it as an inferior form. So that's been a bit of a surprise, I will say. My collaborations with other photographers probably haven't been so surprising. They've been incredibly enjoyable, mostly. And then collaborations with designers occasionally can be surprising, I suppose. Oh yeah, there've been a few surprises working with writers,
Okay.
because writers like to write about stuff, and they sometimes write about things they've never actually seen. And then when you go and have a look at what they've written about, you think, hang on a second, this is nothing like what they said, and that's amusing in a way. I'm thinking now back more to the days when I was doing travel photography, but
Sure.
writers write about churches that actually didn't exist anymore because they've been lost in an earthquake 10 years previously. So there'll be that, but also that writers are not necessarily visually that literate. Some are absolutely, but some are much more cerebral, in the mind. And what excites them will be the human history of a subject. But they write in the context of the landscape without perhaps being that cognizant of how visually stimulating that landscape is. And it's then my job to make it so for the reader. And that can be a big challenge. So in recent years, the recent written collaborations I've done, I've gently tried to, I don't want to use the word educate because it sounds patronizing, and it'll be ridiculous. But talking to writers, with their focus on the written word as opposed to the visual
Mm.
world. I'm really trying to encourage them to believe that what we do is two parallel art forms, rather than me illustrating what they're writing about.
Yep.
That I'm doing an equivalent that is simply what you can bear witness to, because I can only deal with visual reality, and
Mm.
that's a big difference, I would say. Whereas they're dealing with something that's more in the mind and the imagination,
Yeah.
and I
Well,
have to deal with reality. Yeah.
you raised an interesting phrase there, visual literacy, and I guess that is probably where photographers need to look at their own work, look at others' work, and understand the language of visual communication. How much of your success do you put down to the fact that you're able to be visually literate and communicate ideas and feelings through your images?
Well, I think it's an interesting question. I've never been asked this one before.
Good.
I guess that uh, I would say that almost every photographer who has a career that's spanned time and they've sustained it has a fairly good degree of visual literacy.
You'd
So
hope so.
I would like to think that was the case for me. I mean, in some ways, the thing that again, you'll know this just as probably better than I do, but to have survived to this point, at least at my age, at 68, um, and with the having lived through the greatest revolution in photographic history,
Mm,
and managed to come out the other side still getting the occasional commission, and still being able to make a living as a photographer, you have to be able to multitask. That definitely in the 80s, for example, when I was a young photographer, I could have been deaf and mute and still been a successful photographer.
yep.
Whereas I think now the aspects of being able to interact with others, so obviously through being a workshop leader, being able to present videos, to be able to do lectures and presentations with or without pictures, requires at least some ability to articulate your ideas verbally and also on the written with the written word, and that those things are definitely important. And I think the younger generation of photographers, they've embraced that because that's all they've ever known.
Yeah.
Whereas, as I say, to return to the past, so long as your pictures were brilliant, that was all you needed. So
Yeah.
there's been a big difference, big shift there. We've had to become more versatile. And the other thing, and this isn't perhaps a direct answer to the question, but I think it's a really interesting aspect of photography, is that as a working in the publishing field, from let's say 1986 to well up till now, but particularly from in the 80s and to the mid 90s to late 1990s, all I had to do was to produce a really well exposed, well focused transparency
Yep.
that was a good picture, and that was it. I could literally hand that over to, whether it was in the post or by hand, to my publisher, to my client, whatever it
They
was,
take care
and
of the rest there.
they took care of it. Exactly.
Yeah.
And I didn't have to worry about anything else. Well, as you know, the change has been so profound and it's been difficult. Initially, we were expected to make our own scans. And then, of course, as soon as you start scanning, you then have to, can you edit it? And Photoshop was in its infancy when this first started happening for me, and today, all the other transitions that have happened, I print my own work, I capture my images digitally, and I do all my own editing, I do all my own printing, I print for other people as well. All of that has been fantastic, but it's been hard. But I actually feel that it makes photography way more interesting than just being out in the field and being very good at seeing, which is what it was based on or built on.
Yeah, yeah. I think you raised something there that I very much link back to your conversation earlier about, or with painters, in terms of the respect that they would
Mm.
show photographers, particularly these days. I mean, maybe in the earlier days, because of the fact that you could hand off a
Yeah,
transparency and somebody else dealt with that end-to-end process. I think now that end-to-end process is almost as important. If you're very keen on understanding printing in itself, as any listener to this podcast will know, it's quite an arcane art in and of itself, but it's a whole set of skill sets that if you can get right, you can then control your process from the conception of I want to go out and take an image to here's the finished print, whatever size, etc. And I think that
absolutely.
complete end to end does lend itself to being more towards art creation than simply just being a photographer for
Yeah,
for
yeah.
want of a definition, as per what you were saying before. How do you distill that process that you now understand and have lived with for many years?
Mm.
What are the things that you, I guess, have been most interested in? Is it the editing side of things? Is it the pre-production for print? Is it the print process itself? What were the things that sort of really grabbed you in that end-to-end process? Aside from, obviously
Yeah.
going out and taking the photo and
Yeah, I mean that remains, the kind of highlight in a way, because you have the solace of
absolutely,
being
yeah. That's why we do what we do.
exactly. Without that, there wouldn't be any point. However, I mean, quick and simple answer is the editing. I absolutely love editing. I mean, I've got been very involved over the years with print people making prints at offset litho, and every year I see my calendar come off the press because I like to go and see the guys and chat with them about the process. But each year, in a way, becomes easier because you get more and more experienced at the pre-production adjustments that need to be made for us offset litho. However, and if anybody's listening wondering what we're talking about, this is 4-color reproduction for publishing.
Sure.
It's the editing. I just enormously enjoy it. I mean, I think the fact that I wasn't in IT, I've never done anything like that, it really helps because some of my friends who did lots of IT in the first parts of their careers before they became photographers, kind of want to go back to analog because they don't really want to have anything to do with computers. Whereas, I mean, I'm not over computed yet. I mean, I still find I spend rather a lot of time looking at screens when I'm editing, but I enjoy that process mainly because it's a creative process. So the
Yeah.
relationship of colors and tones and textures and how you fine tune all of those things ultimately so that everything's completely invisible, but the work just lives and breathes
Mm.
as a finished image. And that's often quite a long way. It's not a long way from the raw file, but it would, when you click the before and after button and you see where the
You
raw
can
file
see
began, yeah, the
the
difference
difference.
is
Yeah.
profound. But usually the idea is that the finished result will look like or something you could believe you saw. And because nobody knows exactly what you saw, whereas the raw file will often look an odd color, it'll often look quite flat,
Flat.
or
Yeah.
the highlights will be too bright, the shadows will be blocked, and all of those things, because the standard profile that the software portrays is just that. It's very standard, and there's tons and tons of data, in these incredible raw files that we have these days. So obviously that's been a freedom, a new freedom. It's very exciting for me to sort of, it's trying to breathe life into this sort of slightly inanimate bunch of numbers.
Yeah.
and come up with something that has a life of its own, so that the print, and my God, the difference is so subtle sometimes. You know, I made a print last night for an order, and I looked at it on screen. I haven't been printing for a little while, so I was slightly out of practice. And I thought, oh, it looks fine. I didn't soft proof it, and I printed it, and it came out, and it just looked flat, even though it was technically it was good, and I could compare it to the on-screen image, and it didn't look that different. But there was something about it. It just wasn't.
It didn't
It just
have
wasn't
that.
a lot. Yeah, it
Yeah.
was just a little bit of contrast that it needed.
Yeah.
So then I used a easily tried and tested technique I've used many times before, and lo and behold, second print was perfect. So it was, you know, it wasn't that it needed a huge boost, but it was a boost, just enough of a boost that it suddenly you could feel the blood running through the print, as opposed to previously where it was just like asleep. I think that's a way of describing it. And those are very slight differences, but they do matter. And so, you know, that's in a way, I think, the art of photography. The curse of it is that if you ever go to an exhibition and it's not very well printed, it's impossible to enjoy it, however good the
Very
photography.
true. Yeah. I'm keen in talking, while we're talking process and processing of images. Are you straight into editing when you come back from a shoot, or are you one that sort of puts it away, sticks it on the hard
Yeah.
drive, and comes back years later or months
It's a
later?
bit of both. I mean, I rarely come back years later because I am always fascinated by, well, not always. If I know that I haven't done anything terribly interesting, then I can easily just forget about it. And sometimes then 2 weeks later, you upload new pictures that you've done and realize there was some raw files further back on the card,
Yeah.
and you see them and think, "Oh, well, they weren't that bad after all." Oh, that can be quite nice. But I mean, on the whole, I'm always excited about what I'm doing. So I like to have at least a quick look. So I usually create a catalog for a session, or it's part of let's say I've been in Cornwall for a week. That'll be one catalog, but all the pictures would go into that if I'm using Lightroom or Capture One.
Yep.
And you know, and I'll keep tabs on it, and I'll sort of do a broad brush edit, try and find the pictures that I think are going to work without at this point deleting too many. Or delete obvious deletes, and then, but I will almost never print at that point. So then it's a second session, it's a third session. You know, and this is a thing that many photographers find hard to understand, especially wildlife photographers, in my experience, who like to keep their editing. Most photographers I know, wildlife photographers, keep their editing to a minimum,
Yeah.
and they have a kind of little bit bish bash bosh school of edit, which is, you know, sharpen, increase contrast, increase saturation, etc. Whereas it's nothing
Add a
like
bit of
that.
vibrance. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And you know, it may take me 3 hours to, you know, in total. I might spend, you know, 5 minutes early on, come back a second session, do half an hour on it when I'm getting fairly close, and by that time I've turned the image upside down several times and tried to analyze it, you know, in that sense as an abstraction, which is something that I almost always do. But I won't get around to printing it until third or fourth session usually. And I will only print when I realize the picture's good enough to print, when I'm excited. So for me, it's a really good way of evaluating my work
Yep.
is, do I want to print it? If I want to print it, then I can be confident that's a reasonably good picture.
Yeah, no, I very much encourage printing, and one of the things that I have encouraged a number of people to do, I create a book each year. It's not for sale. It's not for anyone
Mm,
else. It's
mm,
replacing our old photo albums, which are sitting in the bottom shelf of the bookcase behind me, and in, you know, a much slimmer volume than those big old fat
yeah, yeah,
plastic sleeve things. But yeah, the practice of printing, I think you need to, even if you're not going to do the end print yourself, if you're going to send that out to a print label or
yes,
something like that, even if you're not going to do that, you should be able to proof your own images. But I still encourage people, create a book every year of your photography so that you can see year on year how you're progressing, but also it gives you something tangible that you can look at. And
yeah.
If worst comes to worst, if your hard drive completely and utterly fails and you can't recover your photos, you've still got a hard copy somewhere,
Exactly.
if nothing
Yeah,
else.
totally agree. I actually think that though that having your own printer makes you a better photographer because you have to be so much more analytical and
Mm.
rigorous in how you edit, rather than just say editing for social media, which I think is a slightly different thing, really. And so unfortunately, I don't do social media. So although I have to full disclosure, I do know I've got an Instagram page, but I don't have much to do with it. It's very run for me by some friends, so it's very nice of them. But really, I'm not. I really don't want to get involved in social media because I am quite suspicious of it. I'm a terrible Luddite, I'm afraid, coming from old school film photography.
Yeah.
So,
One of the things we touched on before we started recording was your passion for the environment and, in particular, your long history of looking at and understanding what's going on with the world's climate. Let's
mm,
talk a little bit about that. What was it that sort of first triggered you to say, hey, this is important. I need to know what's going on here?
yeah. Well, it's so. When I left school, I was 17 when I left school. I actually went to New Zealand and worked for 6 months. I actually worked for about 3 months and then traveled for 2.5 months. And I think that gave me, I mean, it was a kind of revelation to be in the Southern Hemisphere and also then traveled the other way back around the world, stopped
Mm,
off in California on the way. And I suddenly, it changed my life in the sense that it gave me a much bigger view of what planet Earth was like and realized that, that although in the UK we live on our own little bubble and all nation states are a little bit isolated
sure.
in their own way culturally and so on. So it expanded my mind to the world, and it also made me much more interested in our planet as a sort of an entity. And I had already, I'm a child of the moon landings as well. Saw that,
Hmm.
when I was 11, I think. It had, and then when I left university, I went and worked in the US, and I started watching. It was still the days where you watched a lot of broadcast TV, and on that CBS at the time, Carl Sagan
Yep.
was doing his series. I think it was called Cosmos.
Yeah, it
It's
was. Yeah.
absolutely. I was totally in awe and enraptured by it, and it made me think. And he was somebody who's conscious of chemical, physical reactions of our atmosphere,
Mm,
and talked about that a little bit. At the same time, I read James Lovelock's Gaia books on Gaia theory.
yep.
His first book was called Gaia. It was a science of life on Earth or something like that. And this was an interest. I don't know if you're familiar with that, but he was a cybernetic scientist. He only died a couple of years ago. English scientist who worked. I think he worked in Second World War, and I think he worked for NASA for a while, but he invented a machine called the gas chromatography
Yep.
machine, which is so widely used now. It's sort of virtually ubiquitous, but essentially it's able to detect microscopic parts of different gases, parts per million, per billion. And as a result of gas chromatography, we've been able to plot the changes in carbon concentrations. So he'd already started doing that. So by the end of the 1970s and into the early 1980s, I was kind of intrigued and interested and aware of the fact that if you keep putting more carbon in the air than can be absorbed by the Earth's ecosystems, then the planet will inevitably warm. It's not really a contentious issue. It's a well-established model that can be described. And as you know, the Exxon scientists in the 1970s were already well aware of it. They did a lot of.
That's exactly right. I think the science around it sort of kicked off in the late 50s and through into
Yeah,
the 60s. They started to go, oh, there's something going on here. We need to do a little bit more research.
keep an eye on it. And there were all sorts of distractions along the way, like the hole in the ozone layer and the
Yep.
southern hemisphere, which incredibly has been pretty much solved by the Montreal Protocol, albeit there's always unintended consequences with alternative chemicals, which probably have yet to be fully described, or at least in to the general public.
Mm.
And one of the things that frustrates me more generally is how little knowledge there is in public discourse about the science of what happens on our planet. I think people are aware that wildlife is struggling and so on because of habitat degradation and loss, which of course is fantastically important. But the science of global warming is, isn't difficult, and that's why it isn't difficult in principle, at least. It's complex in detail, for sure. By the way, my son is an earth scientist, and his PhD is in Arctic geophysics, so he's basically a climate scientist. So I get to chat with him about these things from time to time. I mean, I should say I am not a scientist. I have no qualifications whatsoever, other than just an interest in our planet and what's happening to it. And like you, old enough to have seen changes in my lifetime. I'm also very aware, by the way, that the Earth's climate oscillates. It does. It goes in long wave
Absolutely.
forms, short wave forms. There are always variations. There's this sort of miraculous no day is ever the same. I mean, it is in some parts of the world, it seems very similar, but certainly in the UK, every day is different because, we're the fortunate beneficiaries of the jet stream and how that, produces these low and high pressure systems that are not always, but frequently changing, and they shift about. And as they do so, we get weather fronts and so on. And, none of those are ever identical. So weather forecasting is still a kind of dark art that's executed not that successfully by people with some of the most powerful computers on the planet. So I always think that itself is quite funny, and it should be, in a way, a source of surprise. There's so many things that we can do. Mathematics itself seems so clinically accurate, and yet when it comes to natural systems, you can't even predict the weather accurately 24 hours in advance. At least not in a granular sense. You kind of get the patterns, and I'm sure it's the same in Australia.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, they're not too bad, but you still get. I mean, that weekly forecast that you get of saying, on Saturday the end of next week, it'll be raining. Well, okay, by Thursday they've changed that, and now it's going to be hot and sunny. So but usually for the next day, you're going to be pretty close, and
exactly.
they're not too bad, but
no, indeed. But to return to the sort of overall theme here, the pattern, over the decadal pattern is one of relentless warming.
absolutely.
I mean, yes, you get some cold winters occasionally, but let's put it this way: when I moved to North Yorkshire in 1993, in November, there was a foot of snow in the garden. And the winter was quite cold. It wasn't a particularly cold winter, but you'd always have several days below freezing all day, and that was common until around about 2008. And we did have two cold winters after that, and then since then, I can barely remember a winter day where it stayed below freezing all day. That may represent a kind of that's a kind of, it sounds a bit anecdotal, and because some parts of the country it's below freezing because it's higher altitude and so on, but that's just where we live. My partner's mum, Anne, who lived in this area all her life until she died, when she was a girl, there would be heavy snowfall every winter. They'd have weeks on end of it below freezing. So I mean, it's been quite an abrupt change in the winter weather patterns. And meanwhile, in the summers relentlessly seem to get hotter, and the springs are now, we have a drought virtually every spring. This one's been an exception, but it's not uncommon now to have March, April, May, June. It just won't rain at all, having had floods all through the winter. So you get everything seems to be becoming more and more extreme, and this is something that speaking to somebody in Australia, I'm sure you're very well aware of.
Yeah, absolutely. It's something, at least for the last 3 or 4 years, I've noticed not only the weather patterns, but the reporting on it within the nightly news broadcast saying, hey, we've just had the warmest January on record. We've just had the warmest March on record, etc., etc. You know, and that's year on year. Those records keep getting broken, and that the fact that it's being reported in the news broadcasts in itself, I think, is good that they're actually
Yeah,
taking
yeah,
notice of that, trying to raise awareness for people. But I think, you know, the real struggle is going to be not just the warming of the atmosphere, but the warming of the oceans as well, because that actually then starts cycles which may become completely and utterly irreversible, regardless of
uncontrollable.
what humanity
Uncontrollable.
decides to
Yeah,
do.
that
And
seems
you
true.
know,
Yeah.
things like the Gulf Stream failing would actually create havoc on the UK weather for as a perfect example of that.
It would affect all of northwestern Europe, including particularly Norway
Exactly.
and Sweden.
Yeah.
And Norway's entire way of life, bearing in mind that nearly half of the country is north of the Arctic Circle, is based on the Gulf Stream. I mean, Sweden inland, further inland, are not nearly as affected, and it's very, very cold. But the Norwegian coast is fairly mild even through the winter. I mean, yes, they get lots of snow, but it's given the fact that it's in the Arctic, you could still navigate those waters right through the winter, for
Yeah.
example.
Yeah.
That wouldn't happen because it literally, you would,
Well,
the sea ice.
we're seeing the Northwest Passage becoming a viable, at least summertime
It
route.
is. It's yeah, yeah. It's just weird the changes.
Yeah.
I mean, my understanding of it from friends I have who I was staying with some a couple of nights ago was saying, the trouble is that up until now, the oceans, Earth's oceans covered 69% of our planet. They're in a gigantic heat sink, so
Yep.
they've absorbed a huge amount of the excess heat from the atmosphere. But we're now getting to the point where that heat is starting to be subducted into the cold currents that the deep sea currents.
Yeah.
And once that happens, you can see that then you're starting to overall increase the ambient in a way which will then be very hard to return to where we were. I mean, I suppose there might well be some people out there thinking, well, in the medieval era in Europe, it was really cold, and wouldn't want to go back to that because that was a period of the Milankovitch cycles when I think it was to do with the orbit of the Earth is very slightly different. As it changes, you get these slight
Sure.
shifts in weather patterns. But what we're looking at now is it's much faster than any of those previous oscillations
Definitely. Yeah.
in climate, and it's directly reflects the amount of carbon in the atmosphere. So I think it would be kind of very, very strange and counterintuitive to try to argue that it wasn't connected when
Yeah.
we know that there is such an effect
Yeah.
as the greenhouse.
Correlation may not relate to causation, but
Yeah,
there's pretty strong evidence that it does.
it,
And
it, it is, and I mean, on the beneficial side of all of that, almost all of the new technologies that are starting to appear now, albeit we still going to need more and more electricity for everything, which means at least in the short term probably burning even more fossil fuels, but over time we'll see that changing to renewables and nuclear. But will we be able to do it in time? And I mean, as a grandfather, I mean, it's a big concern to me
yeah,
that
absolutely. I'm very much in the same boat.
yeah,
The listeners are probably wondering what's this got to do with photography, but I think and
quite
in
right.
particular landscape photography, I think it
Yeah,
actually has a massive effect because
it
some of
it
those
does.
remote
Yeah.
areas are not going to be the way they look now. Glaciers are not looking the way they looked 30 years ago, etc.
No,
You know, so
that's totally,
these natural
yeah.
landscapes that we love getting out into are going to be potentially irreversibly changed, and therefore, I think there's two things for landscape photographers to take away. One is that you've got to record what's going on so that you can see, hey, this glacier has retreated over the last 10, 15 years massively compared to the last 30 or 40 years. But
Yeah.
B, you can also get out there and use that messaging to tell people this is going on. Get involved with your governments and start to get people to think about changing the way that they live.
Yes, exactly, and be willing to be part of the solution as opposed to just being part of
A
the herd.
bystander taking photos of it. Yeah.
I mean, I've got two perspectives on it. I think on that in that regard as well. We talked about geography, autobiography, and metaphor, and the geography part I think is very important. I mean, we globally have this remarkable archive of photography from the 19th century, and of course most of that is of human beings and urban subjects and built environment because that's what people were mainly interested in then. But it was still pictures of landscapes by the
Yep.
likes of, say, Carlton Watkins in Yosemite and
Mm-hmm.
Timothy O'Sullivan in Arizona, and I'm sure there were in Australia. And think of the great Australian photographer Peter Dombrovskis, one of
Yeah,
my absolute heroes in photography. Peter's work, is principally 1970s and 1980s, but that represents a very discrete moment in time with ecosystems pretty intact in Tasmania mainly. And it's an incredibly important record for future generations to see what it was like. So that's the geography side of it. But I also think that it's important that the individual photographer is able to find their own sense of to translate and interpret the beauty that they see in front of them, as Peter did so successfully with his work. And I do feel that that beauty is a kind of universal human value when it comes to nature that
definitely.
everyone needs, and that for work to be preserved, for one thing, if it's beautiful, it's much more likely to be kept because it gives people inspiration just in itself.
Mm,
And also that it increases a sense of urgency about what we need to do if we want to remain, guardians of this wonder planet, and also to be able to thrive into future generations. If we value it because of its beauty, then we're much more likely to make change, I think. And that's where and my final thought on this is that there are some absolutely brilliant photographers whose work is widely known and disseminated globally, who concentrate on disaster. And I think particularly of Ed Batinsky.
yep.
Actually, he's not so much disaster, but his work is of
Human
manufacture,
impact. Yeah,
human impact, and it's really valuable, incredibly important work. I enormously admire it, but there's no counterpoint. And I think it's a little bit sad that we're willing to celebrate and focus on work that's entirely negative about our impact without also contrasting it with what remains that is worth preserving.
definitely.
And
Yeah.
how can we, to get I would, the chances of me showing with Ed Batinsky are zero, but if I could ever have such an opportunity, I really would jump at the chance, because I think that it would be such a wonderful opportunity to show that there are these two sides to our human experience.
Mm,
The exploitation, the ruthless tearing apart of parts of our planet to plunder it for resources, which, by the way, some of which we need for the energy, the electrical transition, and so on. I'm very conscious of that. That's something. It's very easy to be hypocritical about these things.
definitely.
But
Yeah.
then, by contrast, if we get the balance right, we can also preserve the amazing beauty that remains. And actually, the natural world is phenomenally resilient and will return where it's given the chance, as we know.
Definitely. Yeah. Thinking about locations, do you have somewhere that is very close to your heart that you love to return back to time and again?
Well, almost all the places I return to, of which there are several, and they're mostly in the UK, but there's a few elsewhere, simply because I've been lucky enough to go abroad from time to time. Places I would love to, but you know what? If I could never get on a plane again, or even go to the continent by train, I'd be fine with that. There's so much to enjoy in the UK.
Mm,
It's this funny little cluster of islands which largely, well, one might say largely covered in concrete and tarmac, but actually it isn't. If you look at the statistics, I think it's something like 5% of the UK is physical infrastructure, i.e., buildings, roads, bridges. etc. And the
Golf
rest is
courses, etc. Yeah.
golf course. Yeah, exactly. I'm not sure about golf courses. I think they occupy far too much space, in my opinion. But anyway, but there's a lot of agricultural land, and there's still there's about 15% now of woodland, and there's still a fair amount of wildland, but of most of which is in Scotland and Wales, to be
Yeah,
fair.
sure.
But we do have our, wonderful national parks in the north of England and southwest of England. Having said that, they're not, they're not wildernesses in the sense that you would recognise a wilderness in Australia, because a lot of the land is still privately owned and some of it is farmed, different types of farming, and there's shooting estates and so on. But nevertheless, nature still gets along pretty well there. Admittedly, in a we would say, depleted state by comparison with any kind of continental environment,
Yeah,
because it's been
sure.
so changed over the millennia.
Yeah. How do you think the UK, or I'll say English simply because that's where you live as opposed to
Yeah,
Scotland or Wales or Ireland or Northern Ireland.
yeah.
But how do you think that landscape has shaped not what you shoot, but how you shoot?
I think a lot is the answer. I mean, without wishing to become too self-analytical, but I think the kind of cultural, you do absorb the cultural milieu of which you are a part, and
Definitely. Yeah.
it's inevitable that the what you might call the English pastoral vision, which is reflected in the poetry and music of our country, is part of me as well. So there's no coincidence. Frequently will listen to Ralph Vaughan Williams or Edward Elgar when I'm editing. I mean, as well as some of our great rock groups, it's it's not all classical music, but I do love that kind of music, which evokes the, what you might call the green and pleasant land,
Yeah.
of which I'm a part. I mean, that green and pleasant land has an amazing variety of moods and textures to it. So it does come in many flavors. And I've just come back from the south, actually. So, where I'm from originally, I live in North Yorkshire, but was born in Devon and brought up there and spent a lot of time in Cornwall as well as Dorset, Somerset. So, though I'm quite familiar with that part of the world, and love it all, especially the coast. But the effect of it, I think the cultural influence is enormous. The I mean, I'm no great poet or well reader of poetry, but I still, interested in the use of words in relation to the landscape. I think it's incredibly important. I happen to know Robert Macfarlane, who's one of our great environmental
Yep.
writers. I consider him a big influence on my work. He may not know that, but the way he thinks, is a very lyrical translation of the world, interwoven with stories of the people and particularly scientists and writers and other artists that he meets and has worked with. And that sense of respect for his fellow artists, I think, is also part of something that I'm really interested in, is how to sort of see it as a kind of communion place, if you like. And I think that England is so varied across its landscapes, and because it's a highly populated country, it's highly disputatious. It's
Yep.
People disagree about almost everything, but historically we've also been quite tolerant, and I see that as a great characteristic of our nation. I think it's really sad when you see that being undermined, but that's more political. I think in terms of the art, my own interest is to try to make pictures that, and why I think it affects me is that they're defined by subtlety and complexity.
Hmm.
That subtlety and complexity and interest in the mystery of the world and in its infinite variety as something I would like to convey in my pictures. Obviously, it's not going to be in every picture. But if you were to look at a body of my work, what would I like? I mean, I think it would be quite fitting for me, if it felt like it was the work of an Englishman, even though I'm not at all nationalistic. I just think that it's something that you do coming from a part of the world. Even my pictures of the desert Southwest are probably going to be a little bit different to somebody who was born and brought up in Utah, for
Yeah.
example. So because of the cultural background.
Yeah. Nice. One of the things I'm fascinated about is photography's place in society. What's your opinion on where photography sits in society?
That's a great question. Oh, wow. I think that photography it must be one of the most underrated cultural forces in society. And I say that because it's totally ubiquitous now.
Hmm.
With the coming of the smartphone, that was pretty well inevitable. Everybody is a photographer, and in some form or another. And we use, it's funny, we used the term visual literacy earlier, and I'm not sure that it's led. I honestly believed when the smartphone first started to become very pervasive by, say, 2010, that we would see a big expansion of visual literacy, and that people become a lot more sophisticated in the way that they interpreted photos. I don't think that's necessarily happened, but what I do think is that we use photography constantly. And what's interesting is that although you can shoot video clips and film with your smartphone, the still picture is just as relevant as ever, if
Yep.
not more so. And the fact that you can communicate so much with a still image, and yet it's never, ever talked about by cultural commentators, I don't think.
No,
Almost
I agree with that. Yeah.
Almost never. It's astonishing that there is, and I listen to the radio a lot, and I don't watch TV, but I do listen to dear old BBC Radio 4, which is a sort of, yeah, you might say it's the kind of elderly person's sort of intelligent radio broadcasting, and it provides a real nice, interesting variety of conversations about
Mm.
science and arts and culture and current affairs in the world and so on. But it's really fascinating how stills photography just doesn't appear at all.
Yeah.
It really doesn't. It's as if it was invisible, and yet it's so much part of our lives. So I think there's an opportunity there for somebody to do something about that.
Maybe I could sell radio for my podcast.
You could try, but yeah,
I don't know
unfortunately.
that they'd be into listening to
Well,
some.
no, and the irony is, if you think of it in terms of numbers, how many people take pictures almost every day in a population? We have in the UK population of 65 million folk,
Yep.
um, and I will bet you that certainly more than half of them take at least one picture, probably several, every single
Every
day
day.
without.
Yeah.
And if that isn't a cultural force, then I don't know what is.
Yeah.
Because there was a time when yeah, people would say, "Oh gosh, it's fantastic! So many million people watch such and such a TV program." And if it was Neighbours or something, it might be like a fifth of the population had watched it. I'm guessing, and that was extraordinary. And yet, what we're talking about here is something that people actually interact with themselves. They do. They're the ones who get the camera out of the pocket, and they view the world with their consciously, unconsciously, artistically, not artistically. They're still using their phone, their camera
Mm.
phone, as a note-taking medium. And yet we never discuss it. We
And
never
an
describe
experience sharing medium. It's
exactly.
here
Yeah,
I am at a party, here I am at a pub, here's my meal, whatever.
yeah. Well, it's
Here
all
I
of
am in
those things.
front of a beautiful sunrise.
And indeed, and maybe people don't fit. But here's another thing. We might feel, "Oh, what's that got to do with landscape photography?" The fact is, it has a lot to do with landscape photography because so many people want to be seen in a beautiful landscape.
Absolutely.
They take it's one of those things that narcs landscape photographers a lot, is that you see these people turning up in front of this, and they've been standing there diligently with their tripod for the last 2 hours. People turn up and then face away from the landscape.
Yeah, and do
Put
the
themselves
selfie, take a shot.
yeah, and move on because they want to be associated with the beauty that's behind them, I
Mm,
guess. Of course, that's fine. It's a free world, but
absolutely.
it's also it just makes you think. This is something doesn't get discussed. Is how we want to we superficially want to value nature, and yet we don't seem to be prepared to look after it or to examine and analyze our own relationship with it. And we do quite a lot of litter picking in our village, for example, and I'm by no means the only person who does that. There's lots of other people who do, because it's and it's partly because you want it to look nice, but it's also because it damages wildlife. Bits of plastic lying around, particularly, it's harmful, and I think it's harmful for people's sense of place if it builds up. So, it's an easy thing to do, to just do a bit of litter picking. But that's a very, very small, superficial gesture compared with what we're talking about here, which is much more profound, is how we think about and how we treat, our global ecosystem, which is still our only home, our Earth Mother. It is that. I mean, without it, we have nothing. And that's why I think this sort of the fantasies of traveling to the moon and to Mars in any kind of numbers are just that. It makes no sense to me.
Oh,
Why are we
absolutely.
spending so much money on these? And you can see with this latest launch of SpaceX as a which, by the way, since I'm not sure when this is going out, but this has literally happened last day or so on the New York stock market, I think. But the SpaceX will become a multi-trillion-dollar company in terms of funding, and think if you could just take a tiny fraction of that and fund all sorts of nature protection projects, how much more valuable that would actually be to the human
Totally.
race
Yeah.
than trying to go to Mars.
Yeah.
It's infuriating because it makes you realize we could solve many of our problems now.
Yeah, absolutely. I have absolutely no problem with space exploration in itself.
Same here. Yeah.
That's totally fine. But you also have to think about what's going on here and how much money you're spending on one versus the other,
It's,
and
it's the relationship,
get the
the balance.
balance right.
Yeah.
Get the balance
Yeah.
right.
Yeah.
What's the best and or worst piece of advice anyone's given you?
Well, best advice, I think I'll probably go back to university again and say, Jim, my friend Jim, saying, don't take any notices of the tutors. Just follow your heart. That's definitely the best advice. I think I'm sure there've been lots of other good pieces of advice as well. If I've had any bad advice, I'm not sure that oh dear. Yeah. I'm sure all the bad decisions I've made have been entirely my own fault. So I'm not going to displace them elsewhere. So, yeah.
Fantastic. All right. I think we should be thinking about wrapping up now because we've been talking for some time. Are there any photographers out there that you think I need to be talking to?
Well, there's so many brilliant photographers, and would hate to sort of miss it. I mean, all I could do is mention my friends, some of whom you may well have spoken to anyway,
That's fine.
who, yeah, who immediately spring to mind. I mean, David Ward first, always, because he's my closest long-term collaborator. If you know him or know of him,
I know of him, but I haven't spoken to him. So thank you for that.
yeah, absolutely fascinating thinker on photography.
Mm.
One of the most interesting and funniest people you'll ever meet. Mark Littlejohn, a Scottish photographer, another brilliant photographer. Don't know if you've interviewed Mark, but he's also fascinating, great fun to chat with. Daniel Bergman. These are all people I've led workshops with,
Sure.
by the way. Daniel Bergman, Icelandic photographer, another amazing man.
All right.
Lizzie Shepherd. Do you know Lizzie? Have you spoken
I've
to her?
I've seen her work again, but again haven't
Yeah.
spoken to her. I do have a long list, but some people haven't made it there yet, and I haven't
Yeah.
made it all the way through that list because I keep growing it every time I talk to somebody.
Of course, and there's so many brilliant photographers. I spoke with Tim Parkin to Finn Hobson the other day, who's a Brighton-based photographer, and he was brilliant to chat with. I didn't really know Finn's work before, but it's really, really good and just a really nice and a younger generation photographer. So good to get a few of the youth of today on as
Yeah.
well. And on that note, I should also mention Simon Baxter, who
I've
you
spoken to Simon. Yeah.
spoken with Simon, who I've collaborated with, a brilliant photographer and a mountain photographer. I should say I definitely would speak to Tim Parkin if you haven't spoken to Tim. Started on landscape together years and years ago now, and he, although I'm not involved in that on a regular basis, but he's hugely experienced as a fascinating thinker on photography and brings a very unique perspective to it.
Mm.
Other photographers who, if you can get hold of her, Valda Bailey is really brilliant as well. Very well known in the UK. She's a very highly successful nature. She's an art photographer, definitely an art photographer.
Sure.
She uses nature and landscape as a source material, but her work is so completely different to mine in that, there's a lot of very creative techniques used. Yeah, but she's also a wonderful speaker. So it's just so many. Paul Gallagher, Steve Gosling, other friends whose work I really admire and love. Paul Wakefield is, in my opinion, maybe if you had to choose one person who's the greatest landscape photographer living today, he would be my choice.
Fantastic.
So if you haven't spoken to Paul, if you can get hold of him, good luck.
Yeah,
So,
cheers.
yeah,
I'll
but
definitely
anyway,
give it a go.
but yeah, he's extraordinary.
My last question is one that I've been asking since the beginning, and it's an important issue that many people are divided on. Do you like pineapple on pizza?
I probably would sit on the fence. I'm not a fan, but I totally defend other people's
right to do it. Yeah, fantastic. All right. Well, it has been an absolute pleasure speaking with you, Joe, and getting to know you a little bit better. Thank you so much for being on the show. Where can people find your work?
Oh, thank you, Grant. It's been a pleasure chatting with you too. I'm thinking I do have a website, I believe. I don't really get involved with it, but I think it's joecornish.co.uk.
Sure.
And I'm slightly embarrassed to say it, but I think there's also even an Instagram. But I think it might be Joe Cornish Photographer. But
Okay.
I have to say that I don't really know because I don't know how to get onto it. Because tried to make a thing of not having anything to do with social media if I can possibly help
No,
it.
I don't blame you. I wish I didn't have to plug the podcast that way, because that's literally the only reason why I have some of the social media accounts that I do.
Yeah,
Anyway,
no,
thanks again, Joe. It has been an absolute pleasure.
it's a pleasure. Thank you, Grant.
Thanks again for listening to Landscape Photography World. I hope you enjoyed the show, and keep listening because I'll be joined by some great guests in upcoming episodes. You can find my work in this podcast at grantswinburnphotography.com. I'm also on a whole load of social media accounts that I don't really want to be on, but I am. So go looking for Grant Swinburne Photography and you'll find me. Yeah, pardon me. Don't forget to like, subscribe, comment, share the podcast, help people find it, because I'd love to keep doing conversations like these. And the only way I can do that is if people actually listen. I'm Grant Swinburne. Hope to see you out shooting soon.